it's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Z, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel. Broadcasting live from Studio Z.
Makes me act the way I do.
Hello, I'm Liz Grumbach.
And I'm Ilana Rein, and welcome to Brain Dead Theater.
This is where we examine zombie media, television, and movies to explore what we can learn from fictional zombies in our current apocalyptic moment. It's such a pleasure to introduce our guest today, George Hagman, clinical social worker, psychoanalyst, and expert on The Walking Dead, who has written an article on the topic called Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse: Trauma and Transformation in AMC's The Walking Dead. And that's available for download for anyone interested in reading it right away. George, it's so wonderful to have you on the show for our final Brain Dead Theater of ZAM 2020. We'll be back online for further episodes, but this is wrapping up our weekend with conference goers. But how is your apocalypse going?
It's going fine, Liz, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. And Ilana joining us too. This is a lot of fun. And it's a chance to talk about The Walking Dead and the issue of trauma and resilience to an audience that really cares about the subject.
Yeah, that's how we feel too, and that's why we're here. Thank you for being here, George. Just as an update on my end, it's been a long day in the zombie apocalypse. I'm looking a little bit worse for wear, but again, I'm just so excited to be able to bring you guys these amazing clips today.
Liz, it appears that the cuts are on your hand now.
Yeah, I did. I'm having kind of the same problem that Steve was having earlier this week, where I'm blacking out a little bit and waking up in weird places in downtown Phoenix. I'm just like really incredibly glad that I made it for our episode tonight. I remembered to come home and hang out with you guys.
Me too. I think we'll have a little check-in with Dr. Zed after the show, though.
I would absolutely love that. We'll have to call him. But George, you've said a little bit already about the overall theme for the show tonight. I wonder if you want to say any more, or
sure, I would be glad to do that.
Awesome.
Well, first off, I want to say hello to everybody for joining us and for listening to what we have to say. I hope that all of you are in a safe place and that you're protecting yourself from infection and being vigilant about maintaining a distance from those who might infect you. After all, that's why we're holding this meeting virtually, to stay safe, after all. The primary concern during a zombie apocalypse is physical survival, staying alive, staying safe. And a lot of concern and a lot of discussion is about how to do that. But as important as physical survival is, also there's psychological survival, the ability to emotionally endure the highly stressful, even traumatic experiences which life during a zombie apocalypse involves. Over the next half hour, we'll be discussing psychological survival. In other words, resiliency, the ability to adapt to a traumatizing environment, to find a way to come to terms with a new life, no matter how terrible, and to survive it. As an example of the trauma and resilience issue, we'll be discussing the characters in AMC's The Walking Dead, which to my mind is the most accurate depiction of life during the zombie apocalypse. And most important, it's a vivid description of the psychological impact of living during the apocalypse and the challenges to psychological adaptation.
Thank you so much, George. I think we're going to head into watching some clips together, but I do have to warn everyone watching on the live streams, even though our use of all zombie media falls under fair use, sometimes the copyright zombies on YouTube strike without any warning. The Facebook stream, however, does seem to be safe for now, so we'll be keeping an eye on it, but please join us on Facebook. And then, George, do you have, should we introduce the first clip?
Well, the first clip is the first moments of the series The Walking Dead. It's the first thing anybody ever saw who ever watched the series. So I consider it a pretty important clip. It's short, but nonetheless, it really lays out some of the themes which I think we can elaborate and talk about in the course of the next half hour.
Little girl? I'm a policeman. Little girl. Don't be afraid, okay? Little girl?
I love the fact that through most of that scene, there's no music until the very last moment when he's looking in horror at what he's done. The way that scene unfolds is, if it's really the first thing you've seen about The Walking Dead, is you see a policeman walking down through what appears to be an accident, but it becomes increasingly disorienting. And you realize as he's looking at the cars that something terrible has happened. And there's a dead body in one of the cars. But then he sees this girl who he thinks is a little girl. Suddenly, this policeman who says he's a policeman and that she shouldn't worry, that she's safe, is confronted with a child who is in fact a zombie. At that point, the universe is torn apart. Everything is upside down. We don't know what's going on. Yet we're sharing the perspective of Rick, who, in the midst of trying to sort out the zombie apocalypse himself, has assumed the role, an old role, of the policeman, which quickly falls apart. He kills a little girl who's about to kill him, and we realize that nothing in this world is the same anymore.
And I think that's interesting with the policeman, who we see as an authority figure. We see the police as part of the institutions that we trust as a society. And that leads me to think about, like, well, our current situation and what happens when the structures that have sustained us or that we're used to as a society, such as instant access to any type of food we want, home goods. Well, what happens when these systems break down? What happens when we can't trust the police if we're of a certain race? How does that help our understanding of the world, and how does that affect our stress?
Yep.
And I'll add too, what happens when the structures that have sustained us break down? What happens when we, like Rick, we're kind of waking up in a world, kind of spoilers for The Walking Dead, but waking up in a world that we have no recognition of anymore. And I think that kind of trauma of waking up in that kind of different world applies a lot to what we're going through right now. Would you agree, George?
It's a very different situation, but yes, I'd agree that there are similarities which we should talk about. In terms of my idea of trauma, which is related to an analytic one, is that the trauma is about the disruption of all the certainties in our lives, the way our morals, our values, the meanings we give to our day-to-day life. In The Walking Dead, they're all gone, and the fact that there's no government represents concretely the collapse of everything that the people in the program have come to take for granted and depend on. And in the course of that, it's terrible fear, the idea that you no longer have the police or government. You no longer, the uniform he wears, which was so important to him in his life before the apocalypse, is now what? Nothing. There are no policemen. His identity as a policeman is absurd. And at a certain point, he realizes that in the course of the first season. And he takes off and he gives up the uniform. But that, for Rick, is a terrible sense of loss, not just in terms of a role, but in terms of who he is as a person. And that's the worst part of the trauma that they are suffering. But it's also a trauma that we are all at risk for as well. If we become diseased, if we're put in an intensive care unit for a month, 2 months, where everything we are is suddenly wrapped up in this machine, and we can't see our family, and we worry about death, and the people around us are strangers. That's just a little taste of what we're going through. And in fact, that's what The Walking Dead conveys so powerfully.
And I do, before we move on maybe to our next clip, I do want to come back to this this comment from Erica. Thank you for bringing race into it, Ilana. And I think that's very right. We've had a couple of amazing presentations over the past 2 days that are talking about race and zombies. And I think it's important to say that one of the other ways in which we are being resilient as a society is to deal with the ongoing trauma of racial relations in the U.S. and beyond, and racial violence in the U.S. and beyond. So I wanted to just point that out as well. Thank you, George. I wonder if we should move on to our next clip. However, would you like to introduce that for us?
Yeah, I think the clip is from season 4. I can't remember now, season 4 or 5. Anyway, it's after several seasons. The group in The Walking Dead under Rick's leadership, and Michonne is there at this point now, and Daryl and others, Carol, have really lost everything. They're sort of wandering in Virginia on the road. They have nothing. They've lost where they were living. They've lost family. They've lost friends. They've done unspeakable things like a terminus in order to protect themselves. And they're in a state of complete abject loss and isolation as a group. So in this scene at nighttime, they're speaking. And Rick talks about the meaning of the moment to them.
What the hell? Got bit, fever hit, world gone to shit, might as well quit. Dumbass didn't know enough to shoot himself in the head. Turned himself into a big swinging piece of bait. In that mess. You all right?
Try not to puke.
Go ahead if you got it.
No, I'm fine. Let's just talk about something else for a moment. How'd you learn to shoot?
You gotta eat. It's one thing in these walkers and us have in common. This is the closest he's been to food since he turned. Look at him, hanging up there like a big piñata. The other geeks came and ate all the flesh off his legs.
I thought we were changing the subject.
All that payback for laughing about my itchy ass.
There wasn't a lot that came up.
Step back.
Aren't you gonna...
No, he ain't hurt nobody. Don't waste an arrow either. He made his choice. Opted out. Let him hang. Wanna live now? Or not? It's just a question.
An answer for an arrow. Fair?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I want to live. Or if I have to, or if it's just a habit.
Not much of an answer. Waste of an arrow.
So I have to apologize to George and the audience. There was a little bit of moderator error there going on. So we moved on to what was meant to be the third clip, but I wonder, George, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about that clip and maybe what it means to have Daryl's
Okay.
perspective.
Yeah, well, yeah, we'll roll with it, which is actually
Thank you.
one of the things in order to achieve resiliency, you have to roll with things. If you fight them like Andrea does, you're going to be very disappointed, if not traumatized. You got to love Daryl in this scene. It's almost, I find it almost humorous. It is humorous in terms of what he calls the hanging bait, the piñata in the tree. But it underlines him as one of the most resilient characters in the show. You know, he's a kid who grew up in a family where his father was an alcoholic and his brother was in the juvenile detention center all the time. And he was lost in the woods and for days at one point. He describes this earlier, and nobody even knows. And he comes home and he makes himself a sandwich and that's it. So he comes to this zombie apocalypse feeling almost right at home. He's not disgusted by the zombies. He deals with them in a very straightforward and practical manner. His ethics are very clear, and he communicates those to the others around him. And he takes care of himself. He has skills, and he deals with the situation effectively. This is exactly the type of characteristics that a resilient individual has. And strangely enough, Daryl, the sort of crazy kid who comes out of the forest at the beginning with his bow and arrow, has, I think, the most resilient character in the show.
Yeah, you know, in terms of how the characters are either adapting or giving up, it seems like a really important theme is how communities are going to be built and how in order to survive, like it can't just be an individual. So, you know, the strengths as the characters develop, it just makes me wonder, you know, if we're making more allowances for each other, like, okay, this person is literally getting physically sick by seeing this suffering creature. So there's empathy there. You know, so do you think these characters are adjusting the parameters of what they would normally say, okay, this person is someone I want on my team, in my community? Or, you know, do they maybe go back to a time before the apocalypse and use their old sense of coping and community building?
You know, increasingly in the show, that old sense falls away. It doesn't work anymore in terms of what they're experiencing together. And there's a new type of bond and a new sense of family. And in the course of the first few seasons, in the face of their traumas and their losses, that solidifies into something different, something that is not exactly pretty. I mean, these are not our family in the suburb types of people at this point in the season. They are desperate people locked together in a struggle to survive. But in the midst of that, they form bonds that are incredibly intense, powerful, and intimate. And it becomes essential to their survival in the course of this and their resiliency emotionally as they deal with what they're dealing with.
And I like this idea of thinking from Daryl's perspective about how we can affirm a sense of connection, but while still dealing with the kind of grimness of the reality. And I wonder if that's a good way to introduce our next clip as well, George, just to head right into that clip.
Sure.
I think I got it wrong. Growing up's getting used to the world. This is easier for them.
This isn't the world. This isn't it.
It might be. It might.
That's giving up.
It's reality until we see otherwise. This is what we have to live with. When I was a kid, I asked my grandpa once if he ever killed any Germans in the war. He wouldn't answer. He said that was grown-up stuff, So I asked if the Germans ever tried to kill him. But he got real quiet. He said he was dead the minute he stepped into enemy territory. Every day he woke up, told himself, rest in peace, now get up and go to war. And then after a few years of pretending he was dead, he made it out alive. And that's the trick of it, I think. We do what we need to do, and then we get to live. But no matter what we find in D.C., I know we'll be okay. Because this is how we survive. We tell ourselves that we are the walking dead.
Wait them.
We're not them. Hey. We're not.
Wait them.
I think I got it wrong.
That's a great scene as well. Very intense. Obviously, the group is not thoroughly sort of straight about who they are or where they're going, but Rick really puts it to them in terms of the fact that this is what they're dealing with. And at this point, and this is a very important part of resiliency. They're a community. They're a group of people involved in working together to live. They are willing to deal with the reality of what they're confronted with. They actually have a positive view of themselves as a group and of each other. And Daryl certainly has a strong sense of his own identity and his abilities at this point. They all have roles, and they all know how they can work together. So this scene, even though it's very dark, and if they're at the point of despair, it ultimately becomes the beginning of their new life and their new sense of self. There's a tremendous storm. They come into Arlington, and they begin a whole new episode in terms of the series and in regards to who they are as a team and as individuals.
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting comment. Can you just put that back up for a second? Can they be our scapegoats? Yeah, that actually ties into exactly what I was going to ask you, George, because I can't watch this show, and I wonder why it's so hard to watch. Personally, I think it's not just about personal preference, but perhaps like a broader issue. The dehumanization, maybe, I don't know, but why do you think it's so popular? Why is it so wildly popular? Is it because it gives us some focus to work these coping mechanisms out, or
well, I'm not
focusing
sure
on
they
scapegoat?
help us work them out, but it's a very exciting show. It's very compelling emotionally. We're sort of wrapped, we're involved with these people, and they really put their hearts into it in terms of their acting. So there's a sense of emotional connection, which becomes painful at times. At the same time, art does this. It often creates images or stories or music, which is emotionally very intense, at times very difficult to take. But in the end, it's suspension of disbelief. We come away from the show feeling as if we've been part of something that's quite dramatic, but we're safe. We're home again. We're not at risk, even though one of the things that the movie appeals to is the sense of human vulnerability, and that in fact we are at risk, but we certainly are not in as much danger or as in much terror as the people in the show. So it's part of, I think, what horror and warfare movies are about. They both evoke in us a sense of the horror and the experience of it, while at the same time, through the art of it, we're freed, we're protected, we move on.
And then Ilana, I think you had
Yeah, just briefly. In the early days of our current pandemic, there was this esprit de corps amongst much of America. I think we're in this together. Oh, there's shortages. Okay, we can tough this out. There were constant analogies to, well, my grandparents were in World War II. We can get through this. But as it wore on, it was almost as if our country, and I'm singling out our country amongst the rest of the world, almost needed more drama. They needed people walking down the street and tearing and looting and zombie. And when that stopped, and so it's like, do we crave this drama to take it seriously? Like we actually are dealing with a deadly pandemic. Isn't that dramatic enough?
And then if we have a final thought and response to that before we wrap up, that would be great. And maybe something that connects up to how Daryl handles the apocalypse in The Walking Dead.
Well, Daryl is very allied to Rick. They at one point where they're through a terrible assault and they have to kill a group of people, they talk about being brothers. So one of Daryl's capacities is that to form an attachment and form a loyal attachment to Rick, who is the leader of the group. And leadership is really a key element in The Walking Dead, as it is in our pandemic. The failure of leadership is, I believe, one of the reasons why the pandemic is so chaotic and a lot of the reason why people are so frightened. And really key to getting through any of these types of things, whether it's a zombie apocalypse or a pandemic such as COVID, is leadership, and a sense that the leaders are guiding us and holding us together and providing us with a vision of recovery. That's what Rick does for this group, and that's what we've needed and we haven't had. And I think that's really a source of a lot of why so much of this has become chaotic and fragmented.
George. And that is unfortunately all the time that we have today. George, I'm so glad you were able to join us. Ilana, I'm so glad you were here to be on conversation. I do have to say, there is an evening activity. Please look at your hyperlinked ZTV guide or email Christina to get a link to that evening activity. But whether you've been eating popcorn or brains tonight, thank you for joining us for Brain Dead Theater. We'll see you at, or perhaps in, the movies.
I know it's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you.